Chapter 30, Part 3 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alexander Fries. Social Statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness specified, and the first of them developed, by Herbert Spencer. Section 13. Yet must this highest individuation be joined with the greatest mutual dependence. Paradoxical though the assertion looks, the progress is at once towards complete separateness and complete union. But the separateness is of a kind consistent with the most complex combinations for fulfilling social wants, and the union is of a kind that does not hinder entire development of each personality. Civilization is evolving a state of things and a kind of character, in which two apparently conflicting requirements are reconciled. To achieve the creative purpose, the greatest sum of happiness, there must on the one hand exist an amount of population maintainable only by the best possible system of production, that is, by the most elaborate subdivision of labor, that is, by the extremest mutual dependence. Whilst on the other hand, each individual must have the opportunity to do whatever his desires prompt. Clearly, these two conditions can be harmonized only by that adaptation humanity is undergoing, that process during which all desires inconsistent with the most perfect social organization are dying out, and other desires corresponding to such an organization are being developed. How this will eventuate in producing at once perfect individuation and perfect mutual dependence may not be at once obvious, but probably an illustration will sufficiently elucidate the matter. Here are certain domestic affections which can be gratified only by the establishment of relationships with other beings. In the absence of those beings and the consequent dormancy of the feelings with which they are regarded, life is incomplete. The individuality is shorn of its fair proportions. Now, as the normal unfolding of the conjugal and parental elements of the individuality depends on having a family, so, when civilization becomes complete, will the normal unfolding of all other elements of the individuality depend upon the existence of the civilized state. Just that kind of individuality will be acquired which finds in the most highly organized community the fittest sphere for its manifestation, which finds in each social arrangement a condition answering to some faculty in itself, which could not, in fact, expand at all, if otherwise circumstanced. The ultimate man will be one whose private requirements coincide with public ones. He will be that manner of man who, in spontaneously fulfilling his own nature, incidentally performs the functions of a social unit, and yet is only enabled so to fulfill his own nature, by all others doing the like. Section 14. How truly, indeed, human progress is towards greater mutual dependence, as well as towards greater individuation. How truly the welfare of each is daily more involved in the welfare of all, and how truly, therefore, it is the interest of each to respect the interests of all, may, with advantage, be illustrated at length, for it is a fact of which many seem woefully ignorant. Men cannot break that vital law of the social organism, the law of equal freedom, without penalties in some way or other coming round to them. Being themselves members of the community, they are affected by whatever affects it. Upon the goodness or badness of its state depends the greater or less efficiency with which it administers to their wants, and the less or greater amount of evil it inflicts upon them. Through those vicious arrangements that hourly gall them, they feel the cumulative result of all sins against the social law, their own sins included. And they suffer for these sins not only in extra restraints and alarms, but in the extra labor and expense required to compass their ends. That every trespass produces a reaction, partly general and partly special, a reaction which is extreme in proportion as the trespass is great, has been more or less noticed in all ages. Thus the remark is as old as the time of Thales, that tyrants rarely die natural deaths. From his day to ours, the thrones of the East have been continually stained with the blood of their successive occupants. The early histories of all European states and the recent history of Russia illustrate the same fact. And if we are to judge by his habits, the present Tsar lives in constant fear of assassination. Nor is it true that those who bear universal sway and seem able to do as they please can really do so. They limit their own freedom in limiting that of others. Their despotism recoils and puts them also in bondage. We read, for instance, that the Roman emperors were the puppets of their soldiers. In the Byzantine palace, says Gibbon, the emperor was the first slave of the ceremonies he imposed. Speaking of the tedious etiquette of the time of Louis le Grand, Madame de Maintenon remarks, "Save those only who fill the highest stations. I know of none more unfortunate than those who envy them, if you could only form an idea of what it is." The same reaction is felt by slave owners. Some of the West India planters have acknowledged that before Negro emancipation they were the greatest slaves on their estates. The Americans, too, are shackled in various ways by their own injustice. In the South, the whites are self-coerced, that they may coerce the blacks. Marriage with one of the mixed race is forbidden. There is a slave-owning qualification for senators. A man may not liberate his own slaves without leave, and only at the risk of lynching dare anyone say a word in favor of abolition. It is, indeed, becoming clear to most that these gross transgressions return upon the perpetrators, that this even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. But it is not yet clear to them that the like is true of those lesser transgressions they are themselves guilty of. Probably the modern maintainers of class power can see well enough that their feudal ancestors paid somewhat dearly for keeping the masses in thraldom. They can see that, with the armor and hidden mail, what with the sliding panels, secret passages, dimly lighted rooms, precautions against poison, and constant fears of surprise and treachery, these barons had but uncomfortable lives of it at the best. They can see how delusive was the notion that the greatest wealth was to be obtained by making serfs of the people. They can see that in Jacqueries and Galician massacres, when bondsmen glut their vengeance by burning castles and slaughtering the inmates, there arrive fatal settlements of long-standing balances. But they cannot see that their own inequitable deeds, in one way or other, come home to them. Just as these feudal nobles mistook the evils they suffered under for unalterable ordinations of nature, never dreaming that they were the reflex results of tyranny, so do their descendants fail to perceive that many of their own unhappinesses are similarly generated. And yet, whilst in some cases it is scarcely possible to trace the secret channels through which our misbehavior to others returns upon us, there are other cases in which the reaction is palpable. An audience rushing out of a theater on fire, and in their eagerness to get before each other jamming up the doorway so that no one can get through, offers a good example of unjust selfishness defeating itself. An analogous result may be witnessed at the American ordinaries, where the attempts of greedy guests to get more than a fair share have generated a competition in fast eating which not only frustrates these attempts, but entails on all immediate loss of enjoyment and permanent ill health. In such cases, it is clear enough that by trespassing upon the claims of others, men hurt themselves also. The reaction is here direct and immediate. In all other cases, however, reaction is equally sure, though it may come round by some circuitous route, or after a considerable lapse of time, or in an unrecognized form. The country squire who thinks it a piece of profound policy to clear his estate of cottages that he may saddle some other place with the paupers, forgets that landowners in neighboring parishes will eventually defeat him by doing the same, or that if he is so situated as to settle his laborers upon towns, the walking of extra miles to and fro must gradually lower the standard of a day's work, raise the cost of cultivation, and, in the end, decrease rent. Nor does he see that by the overcrowded bedrooms and neglected drainage and repairs to which this policy leads, he is generating debility or disease, and raising his poor's rates in one way, whilst he lowers them in another. The Dorsetshire farmers who pay wages in tailings of wheat charged above market price imagines he is economizing. It never occurs to him that he loses more than the difference by petty thefts, by the destruction of his hedges for fuel, by the consequent pounding of his cattle, and by the increase of county rates for the prosecution of robbers and poachers. It seems very clear to the tradesman that all extra profit made by adulterating goods is so much pure gain, and for a while, perhaps, it may be. By and by, however, his competitors do as he does, are in a measure compelled to do so, and the rate of profit is then brought down to what it was before. Meanwhile, the general practice of adulteration has been encouraged, has got into other departments, has deteriorated the articles our shopkeeper buys, and thus, in his capacity of consumer, he suffers from the vicious system he has helped to strengthen. When, during Negro apprenticeship, the West India planters had to value slaves who wished to buy themselves off before "the Queen's free," they no doubt thought it cunning to make oath to a higher worth per day than the true one. But when, a while after, having to pay wages, they had their own estimates quoted to them, and found that the negroes would take nothing less, they probably repented of their dishonesty. It is often long before these recoils come, but they do come nevertheless. See how the Irish landlords are at length being punished for their rack renting, their evictions, their encouragement of middlemen, and their utter recklessness of popular welfare. Note, too, how for having abetted those who wronged the native Irish, England has to pay a penalty, in the shape of loans which are not refunded, and in the misery produced by the swarms of indigent immigrants, who tend to bring down her own people to their level. Thus, be they committed by many or by few, be they seen in efforts to despoil foreigners by restrictive duties, or in a tradesman's trickeries, breaches of equity are uniformly self-defeating. Whilst men continue social units, they cannot transgress the life principle of society without disastrous consequences somehow or other coming back upon them. Section 15. Not only does the ultimate welfare of the citizen demand that he should himself conform to the moral law, it equally concerns him that everyone should conform to it. This interdependence which the social state necessitates makes all men's business his business, in a more or less indirect way. To people whose eyes do not wander beyond their ledgers, it seems of no consequence how the affairs of mankind go. They think they know better than to trouble themselves with public matters, making enemies and damaging their trade. Yet if they are indeed so selfish as to care nothing about their fellow creatures, whilst their own flesh pots are well filled, let them learn that they have a pounds, shillings, and pence interest at stake. Mere pocket prudence should induce them to further human welfare, if no higher motive will. To help in putting things on a juster footing will eventually pay. The diffusion of sound principles and the improvement of public morality end in diminishing household expenses. Can they not see that when buying meat and bread and groceries, they have to give something towards maintaining prisons and police? Can they not see that in the price of a coat they are charged a large percentage to cover the tailor's bad debts? Every transaction of their lives is in some way hampered by the general immorality. They feel it in the rate of interest demanded for capital, which, neglecting temporary variations, is high in proportion as men are bad. Footnote. When dishonesty and improvidence are extreme, capital cannot be had under 30 to 40%, as in the Burmese Empire, or in England, or in the time of King John. See Mill's Political Economy. They feel it in the amount of attorneys' bills, or in having to suffer robbery, lest the law should commit on them greater robbery. They feel it in their share of the 2.5 millions a year which our metallic currency costs. They feel it in those collapses of trade which follow extensive gambling speculations. It seems to them an absurd waste of time to help in spreading independence amongst men, and yet, did they call to mind how those railway shares which they bought at a premium went down to a ruinous discount because the directors cringed to a rich bully, they would learn that the prevalence of a manly spirit may become of money value to them. They suppose themselves unconcerned in the quarrels of neighboring nations, and yet, on examination, they will find that a Hungarian war by the loans it calls for, or a Danish blockade by its influence upon our commerce, more or less remotely affects their profits, in whatever secluded nook of England they may live. Their belief is that they are not at all interested in the good government of India, and yet a little reflection would show them that they continually suffer from those fluctuations of trade consequent upon the irregular and insufficient supply of cotton from America. Fluctuations which would probably have ceased had not India been exhausted by its rulers' extravagance. Not interested? Why, even the better education of the Chinese is of moment to them, for Chinese prejudice shuts out English merchants. Not interested? Why, they have a stake in the making of American railways and canals, for these ultimately affect the price of bread in England. Not interested? Why, the accumulation of wealth by every people on the face of the earth concerns them, for whilst it is the law of capital to overflow from those places where it is abundant to those where it is scarce, rich nations can never fully enjoy the fruits of their own labor until other nations are equally rich. The well-ordering of human affairs in the remotest and most insignificant communities is beneficial to all men, the ill-ordering of them calamitous to all men. And though the citizen may be but slightly acted upon by each particular good or evil influence at work within his own society, and still more slightly by each of those at work within other societies, although the effect on him may be infinitesimal, yet it is on the cumulative result of myriads of these infinitesimal influences that his happiness or misery depends. Section 16. Still more clearly seen is this ultimate identity of personal interests and social interests, when we discover how essentially vital is the connection between each person and the society of which he is a unit. We commonly enough compare a nation to a living organism. We speak of the body politic, of the functions of its several parts, of its growth, and of its diseases, as though it were a creature. But we usually employ these expressions as metaphors, little suspecting how close is the analogy, and how far it will bear carrying out. So completely, however, is a society organized upon the same system as an individual being, that we may almost say there is something more than analogy between them. Let us look at a few of the facts. Observe first that the parallel gains immensely in reasonableness when we learn that the human body is itself compounded of innumerable microscopic organisms, which possess a kind of independent vitality, which grow by imbibing nutriment from the circulating fluids, and which multiply as the infusorial monads do, by spontaneous fission. The whole process of development, beginning with the first change in the ovum and ending with the production of an adult man, is fundamentally a perpetual increase in the number of these cells by the mode of fissiparous generation. On the other hand, that gradual decay witnessed in old age is in essence a cessation of this increase. During health, the vitality of these cells is subordinated to that of the system at large, and the presence of insubordinate cells implies disease. Thus, smallpox arises from the intrusion of a species of cell, foreign to that community of cells of which the body consists, and which, absorbing nourishment from the blood, rapidly multiplies by spontaneous division, until its progeny have diffused themselves throughout the tissues. And if the excreting energies of the constitution fail to get rid of these aliens, death ensues. In certain states of body, indigenous cells will take on new forms of life, and by continuing to reproduce their like, give origin to parasitic growths, such as cancer. Under the microscope, cancer can be identified by a specific element, known as the cancer cell. Besides those modifications of cell vitality which constitute malignant diseases, there occasionally happens another in which cells, without any change in their essential nature, rebel against the general governing force of the system, and, instead of ceasing to grow, whilst yet invisible to the naked eye, expand to a considerable size, sometimes even reaching several inches in diameter. These are called hydatids or acephalocysts, and have until lately been taken for internal parasites or entozoa. Footnote: the primitive forms of all tissues are free cells, which grow by imbibition, and which develop their like from their nucleus of hyaline. all the animal tissues result from transformations of these cells. It is to such cells that the acephalocist bears the closest analogies in physical, chemical, and vital properties. We may, with some truth, say that the human body is primarily composed or built up of acephalocysts, microscopical indeed, and which, under natural and healthy conditions, are metamorphosed into cartilage, bone, nerve, muscular fiber, etc. When instead of such change, the organic cells grow to dimensions which make them recognizable to the naked eye, such development of acephalocysts, as they are then called, is commonly connected in the human subject with an enfeeblement of the controlling plastic force, which, at some of the weaker points of the frame, seems unable to direct the metamorphosis of the primitive cells along the right road to the tissues they were destined to form, but permits them to retain, as it were, their embryo conditions, and to grow by the imbibition of the surrounding fluid, and thus become the means of injuriously affecting or destroying the tissues which they should have supported and repaired. I regard the different acephalocysts, therefore, as merely so many forms or species of morbid or dropsical cells. Professor Owen's Hunterian Lectures. Still closer appears the relationship between tissue cells and the lowest independent organisms on finding that there exists a creature called the Gregarina, very similar in structure to the Hydatid, but which is admitted to be an entozoon. Consisting as it does of a cell membrane enclosing fluid and a solid nucleus, and multiplying as it does by the spontaneous fission of this nucleus and subsequent division of the cell walls, the Gregarina differs from a tissue cell merely in size, and in not forming part of the organ containing it. Footnote: Schleiden has viewed these Gregarina as essential single organic cells, and would refer them to the lowest group of plants. And here, indeed, we have a good instance of the essential unity of the organic division of matter. It is only the power of self-contraction of tissue, and its solubility in acetic acid, which turn the scale in favor of the animality of the Gregarina. They have no mouth and no stomach, which have commonly been deemed the most constant organic characteristics of an animal. 1846, Henley and others have questioned the title of the Gregarina to be regarded as an organic species or individual at all, or as anything more than a monstrous cell, thus applying to it my idea, propounded in 1843, of the true nature of the acephalocyst. 1848. Colliker has recently published an elaborate memoir on the genus, in which good and sufficient grounds are given for concluding that the Gregarina not merely resembles, but actually is, an animated cell. It stands on the lowest step of the animal series, parallel with that of the single-celled species of the vegetable kingdom. The Gregarina consists, as Schleiden and others have well shown, of a cell membrane, of the fluid and granular contents of the cell, and of the nucleus, with occasional nucleoli. The nucleus is the hardest part, resisting pressure longest, like that of the polygastrian. It divides, and its division is followed by spontaneous fission. Professor Owen's Hunterian Lectures. Thus there may coexist in the same organism cells of which that organism is constituted, others which should have helped to build it up, but which are insubordinate, or partially separate, and others which are naturally separate, and simply reside in its cavities. Hence we are warranted in considering the body as a commonwealth of monads, each of which has independent powers of life, growth, and reproduction, each of which unites with a number of others to perform some function needful for supporting itself and all the rest, and each of which absorbs its share of nutriment from the blood. And when thus regarded, the analogy between an individual being and a human society, in which each man, whilst helping to subserve some public want, absorbs a portion of the circulating stock of commodities brought to his door, is palpable enough. A still more remarkable fulfillment of this analogy is to be found in the fact that the different kinds of organization which society takes on, in progressing from its lowest to its highest phase of development, are essentially similar to the different kinds of animal organization. Creatures of inferior type are little more than aggregations of numerous like parts, are molded on what Professor Owen terms the principle of vegetative repetition. and in tracing the forms assumed by successive grades above these, we find a gradual diminution in the number of like parts, and a multiplication of unlike ones. In the one extreme there are but few functions, and many similar agents to each function. In the other, there are many functions and few similar agents to each function. Thus, the visual apparatus in a fly consists of two groups of fixed lenses, numbering in some species 20,000. Every one of these lenses produces an image, but as its field of view is extremely narrow, and as there exists no power of adaptation to different distances, the vision obtained is probably very imperfect. Whilst the mammal, on the other hand, possesses but two eyes. Each of these includes numerous appendages. It is compounded of several lenses having different forms and duties. These lenses are capable of various focal adjustments. There are muscles for directing them to the right and to the left, to the ground and to the sky. There is a curtain, the iris, to regulate the quantity of light admitted. There is a gland to secrete, a tube to pour out, and a drain to carry off the lubricating fluid. There is a lid to wipe the surface, and there are lashes to give warning on the approach of foreign bodies. Now, the contrast between these two kinds of visual organ is the contrast between all lower and higher types of structure. If we examine the framework employed to support the tissues, we find it consisting in the annelida, the common worm, for instance, of an extended series of rings. In the Myriapoda, which stands next above the annelida, these rings are less numerous and more dense. In the higher Myriapoda, they are united into a comparatively few large and strong segments, whilst in the Insecta, this condensation is carried still further. Speaking of analogous changes in the crustaceans, the lowest of which is constructed much as the centipede, and the highest of which, the crab, has nearly all its segments united. Professor Jones says, and even the steps whereby we pass from the annelidan to the myriapod, and from thence to the insect, the scorpion, and the spider, seem to be repeated as we thus review the progressive development of the class before us. Mark again that these modifications of the exoskeleton are completely paralleled by those of the endoskeleton. The vertebrae are numerous in fish, and in the ophidian reptiles. They are less numerous in the higher reptiles, less numerous still in the quadrupeds, fewest of all in man. And whilst their number is diminished, their forms and the function of their appendages are varied, instead of being, as in the eel, nearly all alike. Thus also is it with locomotive organs. The spines of the echinus and the suckers of the starfish are multitudinous. So likewise are the legs of the centipede. In the crustaceans, we come down to 14, 12, and 10. In the arachnidans and insects to 8 and 6. In the lower mammalia to 4, and in man to 2. The successive modifications of the digestive cavity are of analogous nature. Its lowest form is that of a sac with but one opening. Next, it is a tube with two openings, having different offices. And in higher creatures, this tube, instead of being made up of absorbents from end to end, that is, instead of being an aggregation of like parts, is modified into many unlike ones, having different structures adapted to the different stages into which the assimilative function is now divided. Even the classification under which man, as forming the genus Bimana, is distinguished from the most nearly related genus Quadrumana, is based on a diminution in the number of organs that have similar forms and duties. Now, just this same coalescence of like parts and separation of unlike ones, just this same increasing subdivision of functions takes place in the development of society. The earliest social organisms consist almost wholly of repetitions of one element. Every man is a warrior, hunter, fisherman, builder, agriculturalist, toolmaker. Each portion of the community performs the same duties with every other portion, much as each portion of the polyp's body is alike stomach, skin, and lungs. Even the chiefs, in whom a tendency towards separateness of function first appears, still retain their similarity to the rest in economic respects. The next stage is distinguished by a segregation of these social units into a few distinct classes: soldiers, priests, and laborers. A further advance is seen in the sundering of these laborers into different castes, having special occupations as amongst the Hindus. And, without further illustration, the reader will at once perceive that from these inferior types of society up to our own complicated and more perfect one, the progress has ever been of the same nature. Whilst he will also perceive that this coalescence of like parts, as seen in the concentration of particular manufactures in particular districts, and this separation of agents having separate functions, as seen in the more and more minute division of labor, are still going on. Significant of the alleged analogy is the further fact consequent upon the above, that the sensitiveness exhibited by societies of low and high structure differs in degree, as does the sensitiveness of similarly contrasted creatures. That peculiar faculty possessed by inferior organisms of living on in each part after being cut in pieces is a manifest corollary to the other peculiarity just described, namely, that they consist of many repetitions of the same elements. The ability of the several portions into which a polyp has been divided to grow into complete polyps obviously implies that each portion contains all the organs needful to life, and each portion can be thus constituted only when those organs recur in every part of the original body. Conversely, the reason why any member of a more highly organized being cannot live when separated from the rest is, that it does not include all the vital elements, but is dependent for its supplies of nutriment, nervous energy, oxygen, etc., upon the members from which it has been cut off. Of course, then, the earliest and latest forms of society, being similarly distinguished in structure, will be similarly distinguished in susceptibility of injury. Hence it happens that a tribe of savages may be divided and subdivided with little or no inconvenience to the several sections. Each of these contains every element which the whole did, is just as self-sufficing, and quickly assumes the simple organization constituting an independent tribe. Hence, on the contrary, it happens that in a community like our own, no part can be cut off or injured without all parts suffering. Annihilate the agency employed in distributing commodities, and much of the rest would die before another distributing agency could be developed. Suddenly sever the manufacturing portion from the agricultural portion, and the one would expire outright, whilst the other would long linger in grievous distress. This interdependence is daily shown in commercial changes. Let the factory hands be put on short time, and immediately the colonial produce markets of London and Liverpool are depressed. The shopkeeper is busy or otherwise according to the amount of the wheat crop, and a potato blight may ruin dealers in consols. Thus do we find, not only that the analogy between a society and a living creature is borne out to a degree quite unsuspected by those who commonly draw it, but also that the same definition of life applies to both. This union of many men into one community, this increasing mutual dependence of units which were originally independent, this gradual segregation of citizens into separate bodies with reciprocally subservient functions, this formation of a whole consisting of numerous essential parts, this growth of an organism of which one portion cannot be injured without the rest feeling it, may all be generalized under the law of individuation. The development of society, as well as the development of man and the development of life generally, may be described as a tendency to individuate, to become a thing, and rightly interpreted, the manifold forms of progress going on around us are uniformly significant of this tendency. Returning now to the point whence we set out, the fact that public interests and private ones are essentially in unison cannot fail to be more vividly realized when so vital a connection is found to subsist between society and its members. Though it would be dangerous to place implicit trust in conclusions founded upon the analogy just traced, yet harmonizing as they do with conclusions deducible from everyday experience, they unquestionably enforce these. When, after observing the reactions entailed by breaches of equity, the citizen contemplates the relation in which he stands to the body politic, When he learns that it has a species of life and conforms to the same laws of growth, organization, and sensibility that a being does, when he finds that one vitality circulates through it and him, and that whilst social health, in a measure, depends upon the fulfillment of some function in which he takes part, his happiness depends upon the normal action of every organ in the social body. When he duly understands this, he must see that his own welfare and all men's welfare are inseparable. He must see that whatever produces a diseased state in one part of the community must inevitably inflict injury upon all other parts. He must see that his own life can become what it should be, only as fast as society becomes what it should be. In short, he must become impressed with the salutary truth that no one can be perfectly free till all are free. No one can be perfectly moral till all are moral. No one can be perfectly happy till all are happy. End of chapter 30.